From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Aaron is a hacker and an artist. He comes to us today from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum in New York, but he's originally from the internet. That's actually his line, not mine. But after his talk, you will believe that you will believe that line. If you haven't yet looked at collection.cooperhewitt.org, you should look at it after Aaron's talk. He's been working on that for a while, and it's a thing that won a big award this past week.
The weekend, yeah.
Yeah, this past weekend. Before he was at Cooper Hewitt, he was at Flickr, and I'm sure most of you are probably looking at that right now on your phones instead of, wondering when this introduction will end. Just 2 more paragraphs, but that means you're going to have to read his bio on your own or on your phone. So the last two things. Aaron is really a kindred soul to the people here. He's working as a public employee entrusted with caring feeding of the commons in some meaningful way, and making sense of the way that technology has changed that task. So I found when he came here before that his perspective was very similar to ours. And then the second thing, looking over my notes from last time Aaron was here, one particular comment struck me. We were looking at the alpha release of the collection.cooperhewitt.org, and someone described it as having a sense of fun, and then asked Aaron, well, do you think it needs to have a sense of fun? And you'll undoubtedly discover today that Aaron does have a sense of fun, but his response at that time was no. He didn't think it needed to have a sense of fun, but he thought it needed to be welcoming. And I think that was a good lesson for me. That was I wrote it down and underlined it and put an exclamation point after it. So with that thought in mind, I would like you all to give Aaron a warm Library of Congress welcome. Aaron Strupp-Cope, everyone.
Thank you. Oh, can everyone hear me? Thank you very much. It's great to have been asked to be here. I'm really looking forward to it. First order of business, Jilly Ballistic. Never met her. I've never actually seen any of her work, but it's all over the subways of New York. And she does these amazing cutout stickers of World War I photos. So hello everyone. My name is Aaron. As was mentioned, I work at the Cooper Hewitt these days. For those of you who don't know, the Cooper Hewitt began life as a private museum with a pretty heavy focus on the decorative arts. And we joined the Smithsonian in the late 60s, and in the mid to early 90s, we made the shift from decorative arts to primarily capital D design. And we've been trying to work through what that means ever since. We're closed at the moment. We're renovating. We'll reopen sometime in 2014, and everything is on the table, including digital, including what it means to try and figure out how to make the museum one and the same with the internet, not just a sort of rubber ducky floating on the collection. And so that's what my job is. About 30% of my job is spent sitting around with that other guy who is Seb Chan, a friend and my boss, trying to figure out what I've just told you actually means in concrete terms. And then the other 70% is building it. Historically, museums haven't hired technical staff in-house, so this is a pretty great opportunity. I'm not going to spend most of the talk talking about Cooper Hewitt. There are a couple cameos throughout the talk, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask me afterwards. This is the only URL you'll see in the presentation. There are quite a lot of references and quite a lot of things to point to, and rather than clutter up the slides, I figured I would just put together an appendix, and I'll show this again at the end of the talk. So there's been a lot of talk in the last couple years about ephemera and about how ephemera is some sort of new paradigm that all of our services need to reflect to better map this continuous now that we're living in. I have a lot of problems with this idea. I don't have any problem with ephemera. I don't want to suggest that we map the universe. I don't want to create a mirror world. History has always been lossy. But the problem that I see, and you can point to a couple big services that keep promoting this idea of like ephemera is the new black. One of them is Instagram, and the other is Twitter. And in both cases, I think that what they're doing is passing off an engineering decision as philosophy. Now that engineering decision is fine. Instagram made $1 billion not doing photo storage. And Twitter, Twitter has managed to evolve into something that is genuinely meaningful and useful to people's lives. My issue is that anything that people do for any significant amount of time, no matter how trivial, see also Twitter, becomes a part of their lives. And we want to have some record of it. We want to have some memory, an artifact, a memento. We want to be able to prove that it happened. Which is, I think, part of the reason why people responded so positively when the Library of Congress said, yes, we will do this. We will take on all of those archives. I think that a lot of people might have been a little surprised to discover that all those messages that they were told were ephemeral, that they were told were fleeting, that they were told would pass seamlessly into the distant and never happened, were actually always there. It was just that Twitter didn't want to put the engineering resources towards searching them. And I think that's problematic. Personally, I solve the problem of archiving Twitter by making books every year. But that might just be me. I have a fondness for paper. Speaking of paper, a couple years ago I came up with a clever name, the PaperNet, for this idea that that print is absolutely, definitely not dead. That what is more interesting are the bridges between the physical and the analog and the digital world. For me, this was rooted in an interest around recipes and maps. And at the same time, there was a design studio in London called Schultz & Webb, who were thinking about a lot of the same things. And they developed a concept piece, which they called your social inbox, or a social letterbox, or a social printer. And at the time, it wasn't very much. It was a very well-written blog post and a compelling screenshot of a wireframe printer that would just suddenly start to spit out messages from, your grandma, or you could send messages to family and friends. By the time 2012 had happened, Schultz & Webb had been renamed as Berg, and the concept piece had evolved into the little printer. The little printer is little. It's a printer. It prints on thermal paper, and it's connected to the internet. And that's about it. I mean, it's mostly designed it's kind of just like a little newspaper on thermal paper, which isn't the part that interests me. It's also meant to be a social object. It does a lot of things which I actually find a little annoying. It smiles all the time. Its hair grows. It starts to not smile if you don't print anything. What's interesting, aside from the details, is this idea that it is a part of your life, that it is not just an object that responds to mundane daily objects. It also happens to have an API, which means that I can write myself a little tool to send photos via email to my little printer and have them printed out. So this is the wall that I've got of them so far. And I mentioned that it was thermal paper. And so it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter where I put these. These photos will vanish. And it's already happening, which is And it's an experiment, and I'm sort of fascinated to see what that means. So it's a different kind of ephemera. I think it's a real ephemera, as opposed to all this other stuff. Meanwhile, Yahoo continues to destroy everything it's ever touched. For those of you who haven't heard the news, Yahoo announced last week that with exactly 11 days' notice, they're going to turn off the upcoming.org service that they bought in 2005. Good job, Yahoo. And so this was a quote from Andy Baio, the founder, talking about waking up to discover that Archive Team was backing up upcoming. So does anyone here not know who Archive Team are? Archive Team is a group of volunteer archivists who are simply backing up as much of the internet as they can, predominantly putting it in the Internet Archive. The public face of the Internet Archive is a guy named Jason Scott, who often says, "You'll thank me later." And, you know, the Archive Team they've become kind of folk heroes at this point, because this is what they do. They just swoop down and they say to these services that are shutting down. They're not saying they shouldn't shut down. What they're saying is, you are fundamentally irresponsible citizens for taking this stuff that existed on the internet and simply vaporizing it. And I think that, we as the cultural heritage sector need to look at what the archive team is doing, and think about how that relates to us. And upcoming is one thing. Archive Team principally focuses on static documents, things that can be freeze-dried. But there is a whole other set of services out there, and that's what I want to talk about. Things that that by their nature have moving pieces. And how do we think about archiving those? How do we think about meaningfully preserving them? For a while now, I've been making an argument that the distinction between libraries and archives and museums is collapsing in most people's minds, assuming it ever existed. And I don't mean the people in this room or people who live and breathe the details, but I mean everyone else out there. And to make matters worse, or more complicated, it's happening at a time when we're also being forced to confront this idea that in order to preserve these kinds of services, and I'll talk about some of them, Flickr is the obvious example, that we're being forced to think about running those services ourselves. And I'll talk about that more in detail as I go on. I don't have all the answers, and I realize that there's lots of prickly bits to what I've just said, but I do think it is happening. And I think it's worth at least acknowledging and thinking about hard. This is an awkward position to be in right now, but this is our job. Right? This is why we are granted the luxury of our jobs, not by our peers, and not our professional peers. I mean all those random people walking around outside. If the institutions went away tomorrow, I will go out on a limb and say that we would form the same kinds of institutions. We as a community and as a society think this stuff is important. So I'm going to walk through a couple of projects that I've been working on for the last couple of years, sort of part-time and in the margins of the day, to try and prove, and also more importantly, to try and disprove some of these ideas. And because I worked at Flickr, my worldview has been forever altered, and I can only ever see things through that prism. I'm going to start there. And I'm going to start with the worst case scenario. Not because I know something secret about Flickr and I'm trying to tell you under my breath, but because I think it's a useful exercise. Every time I say Flickr is fine, I hear Jason Scott roaring with laughter. because he simply doesn't believe anything about Yahoo. And they have behaved as fundamentally bad actors in the last 5 years. But Flickr is chugging along. It's fine. But imagine, I mean, what would happen if Flickr went offline tomorrow? Just stop and think about that for a second. Gone. No warning, nothing. How do we deal with that? One of the crazy things about Flickr was that no one ever... we managed to do enough right that people so fundamentally trusted us that they never backed up their photos. And, like, I'm not devoid of ego. That's kind of awesome. We should all endeavor to create a project that fosters that kind of trust. But if I had to do it again, I think I might actually put a little more time and effort into trying to make backups part of the culture. The expression minimal competence here was from a weblog post that my friend Kellen Elliott McRae wrote, where he was talking about just like the minimal competence for web services, and that's basically that you should be able to get your stuff out. Anything you put in, you should be able to get out. And at Flickr, you've always been able to do that. You've been able to do it through the API, and that's part of the problem. You have to know how to use the API, and I think that's probably an unfair barrier to ask of a lot of people. We actually hoped that that would be a market that developers would fill. We wanted them to fill it, partly because we were busy, and also because we wanted to let them reap the rewards of building an awesome download client. The problem, of course, was there was no economic incentive for anyone because no one backed their photos up. Oops. So I started backing my photos up the day I started working at Flickr. Not because I was worried. Not everyone gets that joke. Not because I was worried, but one, because I wanted to use it as an excuse to become intimate with the API, but also just on principle, on the grounds that you always back things up, that lots of copies keep things safe. And so it was 2005, and I went after all the best practices. The semantic web, big long URLs, open source software, XML. And in hindsight, this approach had a fatal flaw, which is that it's incomprehensible gibberish. And that's really, really important. Like, I don't quite live and breathe RDF anymore, but there was a time when I did, and 8 years on, I cannot be bothered to look at this stuff. It's really, really complicated and fiddly. The tool chain is aggressively strict. It makes it very difficult to do anything with. And I don't think that's that's not a particularly good approach to archiving things. So, by about 2010, there were a bunch of ex-Flickr engineers who were starting to rewrite a lot of the core libraries that Flickr used. Not because we were trying to rewrite Flickr, but simply because we wanted that tool set that we had grown used to. And at the same time, I was looking at all these backups that I had created for myself, and I had bags and bags and bags of these RDF files, and bags of these photos. And I thought, worst case scenario, I was like, okay, well, I guess I could put these just folders online. I was like, well, that's kind of awful. Like, what do you do? Click through folder after folder and then like open up an RDF document and suddenly, that's not photo sharing. That's terrible. And so I thought, okay, well, basically we're rewriting all the core libraries. What does it mean to try and imagine an archive, not a clone? A lot of people, when I started doing this, thought I was trying to replicate Flickr, and that's not at all what I was trying to do. I was trying to think about a different kind of archive, an archive that was alive, something that walked behind the real thing, but that provided a kind of safeguard. And so I wrote Parallel Flickr. And I haven't done a whole lot of work on it in the last year or so, which is kind of great. It means it just plods along. It backs up my photos. If Flickr went down, I could just point people at this. So this is kind of what it looks like. You know, the basic model, maps, pictures, thumbnails for navigation. And one of the decisions I made was the archive itself was nothing more than files, specifically the API responses. And this was an attempt to try and keep a logical separation between the archive and the representation, or the manifestation of it. You can always rebuild the manifestation from the archives, but in this case, it really is just a bunch of JPEGs and a bunch of JSON blobs, so text. And, you know, as a last gap safeguard, you could just print these out. You could run the photos through an ASCII 2 converter and print those out. You wouldn't even need a JPEG decoder. It would not be perfect, but it would be a meaningful archive. Again, you know, this same idea of trying to get away from like a, I was talking to Ed about this over coffee before I came over here, and I said, it's really easy to get things in databases. It's not always that easy to get stuff back out. And so this was an effort to work around that problem. Parallel Flickr will download all of my own photos, and it will also download the photos that I've favorited, which is really interesting because you start to get a sense of the fuzzy edges around my experience on Flickr. Parallel Flickr is, I run it for myself and a couple friends. It's designed to be multi-user. And so what you really get is the intersection of all the people whose photos are being archived and then all of their favorites. And so you start to see these sort of beautiful truncated views of people's photo streams as you go along. And it's the things that you and your friends are interested in. And this part is important. The URL structure mirrors everything Flickr does. It preserves all the same IDs. It preserves all the same paths. And part of this was, again, going back to worst case scenario. So what happens if Flickr goes down? A lot of URLs break. And I mean a lot of URLs. And so this doesn't solve that problem except to say, you as an individual can say to people, well, you used to point to flickr.com, now you can point to mywebsite.com. Like, just change Flickr to something else and it will keep working. Not a foolproof solution, but frankly, we're dealing with a situation where the alternative right now, today, is nothing. So it seems like a reasonable compromise. It also becomes a platform for working on experimental features. I did a lot of the geo work at Flickr and was always kind of upset with how little we managed to get out the door. So this becomes a place where I can do stuff on my own. More experimental features. Flickr added the ability to do push feeds, so notifications of new photos. So these are all the photos that my contacts have favorited. Just a lovely way to start experiencing the site again. Like I said, I don't run this as a public service. I run this for a handful of friends. It's open source software. It's not pretty. It does work. And it's a start. It's an effort to at least make the argument with working code. If we have time at the end, I would actually love to have this conversation with people. This is a much bigger conversation, and it's the question of using essentially version control for software for data. At the Cooper Hewitt, we're actually doing this. We did a big CC0 metadata release in 2012, and at the time it was just a great big CSV file. And since then we relaunched the collections website and we added an API, and essentially the metadata dump now is the same data, exactly the same data that you get back from the API. So you can call the API one at a time, or you can download this enormous bag of files, and there's some problems with that in GitHub or Git, and get the whole thing. And it's the same exact response. So that's an interesting place to be. And that question is, do you put all the metadata from Flickr in there? Do you put the photos in there? Because then you can track the changes in the history, which is really the most lovely part about Wikipedia. Every once in a while, people will say to me, how do you back up Flickr? And it's a pretty simple answer. And it is that you buy it. You buy it and you run the service as it is today. Because that is the only way to preserve the permissions model. The thing about Parallel Flickr is there's a lot of people who trusted Flickr and put not public photos in there. And so in order to make an archive, you have 3 choices. You buy it, you run it as is, and you preserve those permissions. You run roughshod over the permissions and you just make everything public, at which point you have to answer some pretty tough ethical questions. Or you opt for only public photos, and then you're left with a sort of weird snapshot. It's kind of meaningful, but not really. And so one of the things that Parallel Flickr tries to do is preserve the permissions model. If you're not logged in, and you're not allowed to, and I don't know who you are, and I know that a photo is marked as friends and family only, this is what you see. Right? You can't see the photo. This is how it should be. This is, at the time that this was done, this was when Path and a lot of other iOS applications were just kind of playing fast and loose with everyone's address book, everything on their phone, and they were making all kinds of excuses. And it's just, there's nothing, it's unforgivable. Like, people put their trust in you, and that means something. So the way that Parallel Flickr does this is, and I won't get into the details unless people really want me to, is it uses the Flickr API. It uses the Flickr API as a single sign-on server. Facebook Connect is single sign-on. That's the easiest way to think about it. You use another service to validate your identity. When you use the Flickr API to do this, conveniently you get back an authentication token, which means that I can pull down the list of your contacts and your relationships with those people. And it means that if an anonymous person comes along, I don't show them your private photos. But if I know who you are, then I can check that relationship. And that's really important, because the other problem is, worst case scenario, Flickr goes down, what happens? Like I said, there's a lot of not public photos. And that means the burden is left to the individual to go through all of those photos and cull them, which means it's never going to happen. It really isn't. And even if there were tools to sort of automate that process, it's burdensome and tiresome enough that, the real risk is that those photos will simply vanish from the internet. People won't think it's worth it. Now, on an individual level, that may not seem like a big deal, but when you multiply that by all of Flickr, it's not awesome. So again, that idea of archiving relationships is, I think, something that we need to think about. The model that I've just described to you is, again, not perfect. It is predicated on Flickr being there to act as a validation service. But it's a start. I'm just going to skip that slide. So again, it's this idea of creating a shadow copy of a service. And what does that mean? Trying to preserve some of the functionality, trying to build on top of the model that it already works with. I think that's really interesting. There's a variation on this, which is what I've been calling the Looking Glass archive. Flickr works by you uploading a photo to Flickr and Parallel Flickr downloading it. Around the same time that I started building Parallel Flickr, I also made another bespoke application called Private Square. Does anyone here not know what Foursquare is? Foursquare is a social service where you check in. You tell your friends and family that, like, I'm at the Library of Congress, and you keep a history of that stuff. It's a lovely service because people have managed to make it their own. You can really check in to the body scanner at SFO. I mean, I haven't tried doing it while I'm in there, but this is what's lovely about it. But I don't always want to tell Foursquare where I am. Foursquare doesn't need to know that I've gone to the drugstore all the time. So this one screenshot is Private Square in a nutshell. Don't tell Foursquare. So what that means is, unlike Parallel Flickr, which pulls from Flickr, Private Square is this sort of weird looking glass archive where you check in, you store a copy of the check-in on your own database because you're using the Foursquare search API to identify locations. You create an instance of the check-in on your backup, your own personal archive, and then you tell Foursquare, which is just kind of an interesting wrinkle. Again, same as Private Square, the ability to start to create a personal record of what you're doing. For me, I started the ability to add ratings to places. Again, you can start to bucket by place, or in this case by time. So you take the time of day and you apply some math calculations to it, and you can say this was at sunset, this was at night, by place. The big problem is ID collisions. One of the really nice things about Parallel Flickr is because it's modeled on everything that Flickr does, it parrots the entire site structure. If you and I are running separate instances of Parallel Flickr, they can be merged together. And to the degree that there are conflicts in unique identifiers, all that means is we have a copy of the same photo. And that's really interesting because, and I'll come back to this later, what it means is you can start to think about rebuilding that social network of Flickr organically, rather than trying to sort of wrap your head around or your mouth around the fire hose. Private Square is meant to be private. You don't actually share any of this data with anyone. So it's not even clear why you would want to mesh two Private Square instances together. But you can't, because there's the very real risk that the individual check-in IDs will bump up against one another. So I was taking some time off while this was happening, and so I had a lot of time to think about it. And I was like, well, that's not awesome. What do you do about this? And I was thinking about it. And you may have noticed that there's a little map at the top of every page in Private Square. And one day I was lying in bed and I was like, I know. I'll generate tiny little images of every single map. And I'll upload them to Flickr in a private account. And I'll use the photo ID as the check-in ID. And then I was like, hell, you could just use Flickr as a database ticket server for the entire internet. You could just upload 1 by 1 pixel images. And seriously, you could do this. They'd never figure it out. They would never figure it out. You could just delete them along the way. So of course the people at Flickr were like, you're a bad man. You're a bad, bad man. I never actually wrote that code. Someday I will. Instead, I went out for coffee. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I was talking to my friend Mike about all of this. And Mike was like, so really what you want is you want an integer as an API service. And I was like, well, no, because that would be stupid. But yes, I do, really. Thus was born, and this is real, mission integers, aka artisanal 64-bit integers. And because Mike made mission integers and I was moving to New York, that of course meant that I had to make Brooklyn integers. Now, these are two services, and you are guaranteed to always get a unique ID from them. My IDs and Mike's IDs will never collide. And this is what one of them looks like. This is the service. You can both create an ID on the website or there's an API so you can do it programmatically. This is absolutely taking the piss, right? Like this is an exercise in like how far can we push it, except for the part where it's not. It turns out to be really serious because you have this problem of how do we deal with ID space collisions? How do we deal with, we keep talking about decentralized web services, decentralized social services, and you're like, great, what about the IDs? How do we fold them back together? Because I, in principle, have no problem with a big centralized service. There's actually a lot of benefit from them. It is unfortunate that they mostly act like, they mostly behave badly, but I choose to believe that's not a given. The other place where it turns out to be fantastically useful is for short URLs. Every single ID on the collection.cooperhewitt.org website for every single first-class object, a person, an object, a type, is a Brooklyn integer. All of them. But the nice thing about integer-based IDs is that you can base 58 them. So base 58 is just math for taking an ID and trimming it down to a short number of letters and characters. And you can encode and decode them with math. That's kind of awesome because there's been a lot of critical writing about URL shorteners, and I agree with most of it. What this does is allows you to preserve the ID. You can look at a URL shortener. You can look at a short URL, and you can know what it actually points to. So if Trinidad and Tobago ever decides that they hate freedom and they want to get rid of our DNS entry, those URLs are still, they may not work, but they can be resolved. And I think that's kind of important. Just briefly, the creation myth. I mentioned that Mike and I managed to have unique IDs, despite the fact that we don't keep track of them. And the way we do that is simply that we offset the counter by 2, and Mike gets the even numbers, and I get the odd numbers. Is that right? Yeah. The reason is, at the time that we were doing all of this, Mike was still a partner at Stamen Design, which is located at the corner of 16th and Mission in San Francisco. And because Stamen is located on the right-hand side of the street at 2017, I get the odd numbers, or the right-hand coast, and he gets the even one, the left-hand coast. So you may be wondering, as a few people have asked us, were we trying to corner the market on integers? And the answer is absolutely not. Brooklyn Integer's motto is, we have infinity on our side. And then this happened. So London Integers is the brainchild of an old friend of mine named Dan Catt. And Dan decided that what he was going to do was he was going to mint all the numbers that were divisible by 9. So in effect, Dan has claimed 10% of the entire number space. Our solution was simply to figure out what the offset was amongst a number of different providers. I will come back to this. Okay. Identifiers. Spacetime IDs are another bit of a joke, except not really. Spacetime ID is a fancy, funny name for three-dimensional Hilbert curves. Hilbert curves are a way of organizing a lot of points along a line, whether it's in two-dimensional or three-dimensional space, so that it's easy to find neighbors quickly. So geo people love this. So I was reading about it one day when I was still working at Flickr, and I realized, looking at the code, that the code just said to generate a big unique ID, you need X, Y, and Z. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, because essentially what you could do is you could create a unique ID for every moment in space and time, which is kind of awesome. I mean, a little pointless maybe, but kind of awesome. And I thought, oh, you could do it for photos too, right? Like, what if you gave every photo a space-time ID? Now, there's a gaping privacy hole, which is why we never did this at Flickr. Because like base 58 shortcodes, you can both encode and decode a spacetime ID. So we were serious about privacy at Flickr, so we didn't do this. But I was telling a friend about this last fall. We were walking around Seattle. And I was telling him this, and at one point I stopped, and I was like, oh my God. So not so good for photos, but we're a design museum, the Cooper Hewitt. We traffic in things that are mass-produced. We traffic in things that there's lots of them all over the world, like fire hydrants. I couldn't find a picture of, I don't actually think we have a fire hydrant, so I put up a picture of a flashlight. I don't know what to do with this yet, but I think this is kind of fascinating. I mean, this is a callback number, right? You've got the semantics encoded in the ID. This is a way to assign a unique ID to all those fire hydrants and to say where they are and to say what their lineage, what their parentage is. Again, not sure what to do with this yet, but I think it's interesting. And the point of all of this is to make sure that things are present on the network, to give people confidence. The thing that we're trying to do at the Cooper Hewitt is to create a system where we can say, if you see a URL today, it will be there in 100 years. And so a lot of that has to do with addressing and identifying and thinking about how you refer to things. The cultural heritage world, the sort of default answer to all questions, like the fallback answer is, well, we're in it for the long game. You're just a company, you're not going to be here in 50 years. And that's good, that's what we're supposed to be doing, but we don't really treat the network that way. We certainly don't talk about what we do online in the same way, and I think we should. So this is the part where I'm going to make a couple of proposals. One of them is very serious, and the other one is only as serious as there's room left over after I talk about the really serious one. Again, if there's time, because I think I'm starting to run late, if there's time, I would love to talk to people about that little computer. If you don't already recognize it, it's called a Raspberry Pi. It's just a computer, right? It's not going to make the Earth move. But it is a computer that's more powerful than a lot of the computers we had on our desktops a few years ago. And it's $35. And there's some kind of amazing stuff that you can start to think about doing when you have a $35 computer. So, the first proposal is for the Ministry of Numbers. You may have noticed that there was a couple of problems with the artisanal integer services. One of them is you have to know all the other ones, and you have to know what their offsets are. Or you end up in an arms race with people like Dan Catt, who are just going to try and gobble up all the numbers. So a friend of mine named Nelson Minar did some reading, and he was like, I think I've got the solution, and it's math. And it's math called Cantor pairing. And basically what you need is an index, a number to identify a particular provider, and then you need that provider's last largest integer. And so again, like the spacetime IDs and like the shortcodes, what Cantor pairing gets you is provenance. You can look at an ID and decouple it, and you can say, oh, that came from the Mission, or that came from Brooklyn. And there's the math. That's how it works, in case anyone's curious. And I spent some time looking at this, and I wrote Nelson back, and I said, well, if I'm reading this correctly, I think what I'm seeing is the problem with your solution is you take the 64-bit integer space, which is the enormous number pool that we have today for computers, and you reduce it back down to about the 32-bit number space, which is where we were like 10 years ago. And I thought, well, that's not very good, because we sacrifice a lot of numbers. And Nelson wrote back and he said, yeah, he said you could probably get away with a maximum of 1,000 foundries. So 1,000 unique foundries just minting IDs left, right, and center. And he said, you wouldn't run out of numbers. That would work. And you're like, oh, well, that's not ideal because you want a magic world where, like, let 1,000,000 foundries bloom, that kind of stuff. Or you realize that there's only like 280 countries on the planet, maybe 285. So you're like, maybe we could just get the UN to run the Ministry of Numbers. Or the Library of Congress. I'm only half joking. I mean, I think that this is the kind of thing that the library can start to think about doing because we occupy a position of trust. Or you do. I just work at a design museum. This is the other one. I'm going to pull at some heartstrings because for those of you who don't instantly recognize the woman on stage, that's George Oates. She started the Commons. You guys helped start the Commons. I said this during the brown bag lunch. For most of the people who have ever worked at Flickr, the Commons is the single best thing we ever did. Period. So, thank you. But George and I were talking about the work that I was doing around parallel Flickr and some papers that I was writing about this, and it was this question about where do you even start? How do you back up Flickr? And so this is George's idea, and it's pretty much genius. George said, what if you start with the Commons? Because that's easy pickings. The photos, there's no licensing issues. What if you start with that as the core, and then you find all the people who've touched those photos in one way or another, left a comment, favorited, anything, and you archive their photos and their favorites. And you could do that 1, 2, 3 degrees out. Because what becomes super fascinating is all those photos that were in the Commons are suddenly set next to the photos of the people who interacted with them. And that's kind of beautiful. Now, blanket archiving people's photos is a little creepy, so you would have to make it opt-in. There's no good way to get in touch with people on Flickr in an automatic fashion, so I don't have the answer for that. But I bet, let's just take the Library of Congress as an example. I bet if the Library of Congress said, if you put out a press release or whatever, you got the word out and you said, we want to do this. We want to archive your photos. We want to archive them in the context of the Commons. Please come here, click this button, and we will start to archive them. And what you also say is, we will preserve the privacy model as it exists today. Now, I'm not suggesting that you run off and use parallel Flickr. You can think about parallel Flickr simply as a reference implementation. The issue and the opportunity is for the Library of Congress or any other Commons participant or anyone else in a position of trust, because that's what this boils down to, trust. Will say, we pledge for as long as we can use Flickr as a validation service, we pledge to honor the permissions. Private photos are private, friends and family, you have to be logged in. But what happens if Flickr goes away? And this was from a conversation with Jason Scott at the Internet Archive. And what I've been proposing is the moment that, for whatever reason, an institution can't rely on Flickr as a validation service, the 70-year rule kicks in, where for some definition of 70. What that means is if a photo isn't already public, it instantly goes dark. It's gone for 70 years, and then afterwards, it reemerges and is part of the public domain. Now, instantly, the first thing I think of is, how do you reconcile that with all those photos that are already public? Like, do they all become public at the same time? I don't know. But I think that might be an interesting way to deal with that problem, because people when the Commons started, there were a lot of people who were like, I want to put my photos in the public domain. How do I do this? And we were like, there is no way to do it. You can't. But I do think that people want to be able to share their time here. The library in particular has the opportunity to exist somewhere between the space we're in now, where you just have like buckets of photos in secondhand stores, and Facebook. Like, it has an opportunity to become a zone of safekeeping for the future. Is anyone here from the National Archives? Okay. So, National Archives, right? This is amazing photos from the 70s. And I'm pretty sure if you showed most of them to someone in 1974, they would have just been like, what? But like, it is not for us to judge. So that's a very serious proposal. And what it means is it also allows individual institutions to start to archive pieces on a manageable basis. You don't have to try to swallow the ocean. And at a time of your choosing, you can fold them back together. That's kind of amazing. So now the honeypots and the archive realism. I confess I don't know very much about archive realism. It's a term that I only just discovered, but it's really sort of lovely. It's sometimes referred to as database realism. And apparently the practice is for artists to basically just start trawling through databases of records and archives. And it's what makes Julie Ballistic's work so interesting, is she's just she's just culling from all these photos of World War I and figuring out what to do with them. And again, that's an opportunity we have. And the honeypots is, Facebook is the world's best honeypot ever. Right? If you don't know what a honeypot is, it's a term used in security circles for you set up a machine where you want bad people to come in and start mucking about so that you can watch them and learn from them. I mean, I don't have a Facebook account, but I cannot deny the value that it has in people's lives. And, they're basically, they will become us if we let them. Thank you. Yes?
As a material culture person, I'm actually very interested in the model you suggested for a possible way to have a time, a space-time provenance marker for every single physical object in say, the Cooper Hewitt's collection, or perhaps in the world. If you look at, I've done a little bit of research on the sort of the origins of object-oriented programming ideas, and I think those were based on a kind of almost platonic ideal of how the world, objects in the world are created from you have a concept of what a chair will be like, and then we have this specific chair right here, which is brown and came from a certain supplier and has been in this room for the X number of years, so that's its provenance. So I almost feel like it would be a kind of interesting way to go backwards and to then try to apply a data model to storing that information about the objects that actually do exist by reintegrating them into an object-oriented environment. So I don't know if your idea for those markers would then be object-oriented. For those who don't know, it's sort of in the programs, there's sort of parent classes and then children, and the children are somehow quote-unquote genetically related almost. So again, there's the ideal chair, and then the specific brown chair would be a child of the parent. So I don't know if your vision.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would go so far as to say I have a vision. I mean, there is a service called Spacetime where you can go and mint Spacetime IDs. That one sort of keeps coming back in fits and starts. I think that, for us, in general, like, I just want things to be addressable. I want for someone to be able to, when I talk to people, I say, for us, the goal has to be to get people in the building, because we believe there's still something fundamental about the objects themselves. if there isn't, we have to ask the question, why do we have a building? Like, what's the function of it? But at the same time, I want anything that's in the museum to be accessible from the sky, right? And vice versa. Like when you see something online, you should be able to know that it's come into the building, that it's on display, that is just taken for granted. And so a big part of that is trying to figure out what the minimum amount of addressability is without going sort of too far. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the space-time IDs fit in, but I do think that's kind of a lovely opportunity that we have. To be able to, ideally, I used to say to people that the great advantage that Flickr had over all the other services was that we trafficked in photos, right, for which we are hardwired. Right? And I've got 10,000 years of history to back up that baseless claim. Everything we did, geotagging, people tagging, all of it was built on that. And that was the opportunity. And what I've said to people is the opportunity that the Cooper Hewitt has as a design museum is, right, like, it's all ours. All, like, design, right? Like, elegant solutions in the function, in the function of a problem. And so you should be able to look at something, and ideally, this is a sort of idealized worldview. We don't have that many things in our collection. But, like, you should be able to know. So I've kind of spiraled a little bit off topic, so I'm just going to stop there with that one. Yes?
When you're talking about space-time IDs, and are you thinking in terms of curator-assigned IDs or creator-assigned IDs? As somebody who now, rather than being a curator, is working on the copyright side, read the space-time IDs, a lot would be answered about rights. Wouldn't tell you the owner, but it would tell you something about country in terms of copyright if the space-time ID corresponded to creation.
That's an interesting question. I've not thought about it that way. I guess I've always thought about it in terms of, well, I've been thinking about it recently in terms of the object ID.
Object ID assigned by a curator. Or the creator.
By the institution, so the curator or the registrar system. And the idea is to be able to resolve that ID to actual words. One of the things that I've been saying to the curators is the last thing we want you to do is strip mine your knowledge into rows and columns, right? Like, we need to do some basic bracketing for search, but the thing that computers don't do particularly well is encode debate. And, fundamentally, that's what we do. We traffic in debate. And that's why it's interesting. So, if we could provide an ID that could simply tell you how to get back to those stories, that would be good enough, I think. Yes?
In your scenario where this hypothetical scenario where we're archiving public domain, things in the commons, right, in Flickr. As a Flickr user, one of the things I do when I put photos up there is I can say what license I'm going to use, and there are some options for Creative Commons licenses that you can select. Have you thought about sort of using that as well? Do you think that would be a valid way to select things for archiving, or in your experience at Flickr, did you see that not getting used that much, or I'm just curious about the role that Creative Commons has.
Yeah, definitely, and we did see it happening. I don't know if it was the National Library in New Zealand or another organization, but they would nightly crawl the API looking for uploaded photos that had been uploaded that day with a CC license in New Zealand, geotag photos, and they would just grab a copy. And that's definitely one way to do it. I think the opportunity in inviting users to participate and actually to archive their Flickr account is that, one, from a purely selfish point of view, for users, it means there's a degree of security because, this is what the Library of Congress or, the National Art Library in Amsterdam or wherever, this is what they do. This is what we've always done. We keep things safe for the future. And so there's a burden. You take on that responsibility of like all those bytes. But I think that, you foster a relationship with people because suddenly they're invested in what you do. And also it is this part where, I think I mentioned at the beginning, like history has always been lossy. And you can sort of see that, the model has always been that you, sooner or later, you go trawling through the archives, just like turning page after page after page, or traveling to some other country and looking. And it's like, what if we could stop kneecapping the future and actually keep that stuff now? Like we don't. This is the really interesting thing in the museum context, is making the argument that simple inclusion no longer automatically confers notability. And this is a great opportunity we have. We have databases. We can do this. There was a woman a couple years ago who was going to do a project to document all the roadside restrooms along the American interstate system. Beautiful project. Her argument was, look, it's all being underfunded. It's all being outsourced to commercial vendors. All of these rest stops are basically turning into corrugated metal siding with a Burger King inside. And at the time that they were created, there were distinct and unique regional differences. But if you said to somebody in 1950, I'm going to travel the country and take pictures of bathrooms, you probably would have been laughed at. We just don't know. And so I think that's, it's a strange spot to be in. But I think it is that ability to actively foster a relationship with people by saying, your photos are important to us. And again, if you made it opt-in, there's a lot of details you'd need to sort through. But if people were able to say, I totally want to do that, I think you'd see an amazing response. Did you have a question?
A couple. Why, hopefully not too technical. Why do you think it's important to have sequential integers as identifiers? Like if you were to relax that constraint a little bit, wouldn't you then get around the problem of placing authority somewhere? And the second question, kind of related, is would the Cooper-Hewitt ever respond to a pull request on its metadata stored in GitHub?
Okay, so I'll answer those two questions separately. The first is because Mike and I spent about 2 weeks building this. This was all starting in the time just before I left San Francisco to move to New York. And we were just sort of going back and forth, and it was funny, haha. And the last night I was there, we went out for a drink, and we were like, well, how would we build this? And we went for the simplest, dumbest possible solution, which was just, well, let's just count upwards, and we'll just not step on each other's toes. And we were like, well, that would work. Done. And then I started working on the collections website, and I was like, oh, we're totally going to use these. We need these. So the reason it exists right now is because of working code. Do they need to be sequential? No, they need to be incrementing. Or you end up having to do something like what Nelson suggested, where you have complicated math, and you end up trimming the ID space. Tell me what the second question was?
Would you ever take a pull request?
Yes, absolutely. We have gotten pull requests, and it has highlighted an interesting problem, which is that we don't internally have the social, for lack of a better term, infrastructure. We just haven't developed the social norms to deal with people correcting our data. But we know we want to, and we need to. You know, when we did the first metadata dump, I think I'm not supposed to say this live on TV, but you know, there's a record of it in GitHub. We had 5 different spellings of American. So, yeah, that's something that I would like to actually try and solve soon, or at least work through, start working on it, because it's really important. All right. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.